Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we are up to Symphony number 38 in C major. And this is a particularly fascinating opportunity to compare this C major symphony with its predecessor, Symphony number 37 in C major. And the reason is because they're both in C major. Get it? No, I'm just kidding. No, the reason is because they're both scored similarly. This is C major with trumpets and drums, but although they are numerically next to each other, they were actually composed about 10 years apart. The number 37 was one of the earliest of all of them, all of the symphonies. It was written in the 1750s, and this one was written in the late 1760s, when Haydn had already been at Esterházy for half a decade or so, or a little bit more, and so his style had changed somewhat. In addition, although these are both C major symphonies with trumpets and timpani, which is unusual enough, at Esterházy, Haydn also had high horns in C major, who specialized in playing in that register. And very few other ensembles of the period had this particular combination. And those high horns give the music an extraordinary level of additional tension and the opportunity for Haydn to separate the two brass sonorities, which he does sometimes in the symphony, to a very telling effect. So if you heard number 37, this will be very interesting. You may want to go back and listen to it again before you listen to this, because the comparison is salutary. I'm telling you, you're going to learn a few things about how Haydn operated. One of the things that we can learn immediately is, how does Haydn break down the squareness of music with trumpets and timpani? And he does it in very different ways in these two symphonies. In number 37, remember, there was a lot of interesting minor key music, fascinating excursions into Hungarian folk music or ethnic music, things that instead of the usual dum-ba-da-dum-bum-bum, bum-ba-da-dum-bum-bum, I mean, that's what trumpets and timpani did in those days. They were very limited. They only had a small number of notes in any given key that they could use, and they were basically there for rhythmic emphasis and to make noise in loud sections. Haydn, of course, uses them at all dynamic levels. He always did. But in that earlier symphony, he sectionalizes the music in a way so that there's always a certain digression into something really kind of intriguing and interesting, usually without the participation of the trumpets and timpani. This symphony is rather different. This symphony has two overarching concepts that tend to keep the trumpets and drums in their well-integrated place within the ensemble. Now, the first of these is absolutely marvelous to talk about and to listen to. It's going to be really cool. It's unusual phrasing. That is, melodies that don't last as long as you think they're going to. One of the best ways to counteract the squareness of all of these little fanfare things that the trumpets and drums are doing, and the horns in this case, is to make the amount of time that they do it an odd number, so that the balance of phrases isn't quite what you think it's going to be. And Haydn does that right at the very beginning of this symphony. It's really, really cool. The opening theme of this symphony lasts 14 bars, which is, you say 14, it's a nice even number. Well, yes, it is, except that those 14 bars are broken up into two 7-bar phrases. And 7 is an odd number. It's a prime number. And the normal kind of phrasing that you hear in any kind of music, whether it's classical or not, is 4 and 8-bar phrasing. That is symmetrical phrases lasting 4 or 8 bars. And so let's say, I'm just to give you an example. If you're in normal time, which is 4 times, that is 4 beats to a measure, then you would have 8 measures of 4 beats each, or 32 beats that you could spread your tune over. In this case, you only have 7. And that missing bar, those 7 measures, makes all the difference in the world, especially when you have a tune like the opening of this tune, because you hear it twice, in both times lasting 7 bars, and it sounds like it's tripping over itself. It sounds like maybe someone kicked the record player and the needle. Remember record players? And the needle skipped back to the beginning, unexpectedly. The tune, I can play the tune, but it's so much more fun to sing it. It's dum ba dum ba ba da 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 dum ba da da dum ba da 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 dum ba 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 bum. Well, it's da ba 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 bum ba da dum ba ba da da. It starts over again, just like that. And when I play it, I'll mark each 7-bar little moment so that you can hear how they go. But it has such a nifty effect of making the music sound somehow in a rush, to interrupting itself as it's going. And that's just great. I mean, that totally interrupts or disrupts the idea of just this dum ba dum bum bum ba dum bum bum ba dum bum bum ba dum bum, which can become monotonous very, very, very quickly. So that's one strategy for breaking up the rhythmic what do we call it? Regularity. There's the word of music with trumpets and drums in the classical period. The other thing that Haydn does is that instead of having the minor key digression, that tiny little Hungarian thing, which was the second subject in Symphony Number 37, which only lasted a few seconds, Haydn waits. He waits until the development section of this movement, and the entire development section is in a minor key. The whole thing. He gives you a big extended dose of minor, and it's actually just about the only extended period of minor key music in the whole symphony. This is a very happy symphony. It's really quite jolly for the most part. And so by giving you a bigger dose of minor, he makes the contrast broader and bigger than in Symphony Number 37, even though the length of the two symphonies is almost identical. But the contrasts are bigger, and that gives you a greater sense of expansiveness, of taking time, of working in larger chunks. And that really is going to be Haydn's technique from here on, which is broadening the scheme of contrasts in his symphonies, so that even though he always remains somebody who's very compressed, he's always working on a rather small scale, but he doesn't want it to sound compressed. He wants it to sound expansive and grand, and he achieves that by waiting to have a really long, extended minor key episode. And so I'm going to run the whole movement now, as usual, without repeats, and I'll indicate where the overlapping phrase rhythm is. I just love the fact that Haydn does this, and it's so easy to hear. That's what's so cool about it. I mean, he doesn't. I always said Haydn, he never tries to trick you. He wants you to hear how much fun he's having, and we do. So let's just listen. This was, again, the Cologne Chamber Orchestra with Helmut Müller-Brühl, and aside from the unnecessary harpsichord continuo, these are really good performances. I mean, they really are. I forgive the harpsichord because the performances are so lively and so nicely done. So let's listen to the entire first movement all the way through. We don't have to do bits and things. You're far enough along, more than far enough along, to be able to take in the whole thing. So here it is. First movement of Symphony Number 38. Wasn't that fun, huh? But you could tell, right, how much bigger it sounded than number 37, even though it's almost exactly the same length. It's all a question of contrast and a question of that wonderful tricky phrasing that Haydn was such a master of. I mean, nobody had that kind of feeling for rhythm and timing. Certainly not in the 1760s, which is what we're talking about now. Later on, we had Mozart and Beethoven who had their own ways of doing things, and they were just as successful. But still, Haydn was Haydn. He always was Haydnesque. Now, the second movement, as usual with most of these second movements at this period, unless you have a symphony that begins with a slow movement, what they call a church sonata symphony, where you use the full orchestra as often as not, these slow movements are for strings only. They don't use the winds. This gave the wind players an opportunity to rest, but it was also a function of contrast too, especially with those noisy, brassy outer movements. This was an opportunity to do something that would give the ears something else to focus on. Now, none of the movements in this symphony is particularly slow. In fact, 3 of the 4 movements are all marked molto. And, that is allegro molto, which is very frisky, and andante molto, which is a lot of andante-ness, which is a walking pace. It's a little quicker than usual. And even the minuet is marked allegro. Usually minuets are sort of slower than that. And the finale is another allegro molto. So this is a get up and go kind of symphony. It really is. But this slow movement gave this symphony a nickname, which nobody knows because we never use it. And that nickname was called Echo. It was the Echo Symphony. The strings are divided. As usual, you have first and second violins. But in this case, the second violins are muted. They put on their mutes. You ever seen a violin mute? Haydn has written movements before with muted strings, but usually they're all muted. In this case, the first violins are not, the second violins are. And the second violins have a mute. It's a little it looks like a comb, and you stick it on the bridge of the instrument, and it gives the strings a sort of husky, veiled sound. It's quite lovely. Beautiful for sort of nocturnal music, delicate effects. And the effects here are quite delicate because they're echo effects. And the second violins echo the phrases of the first violins throughout the movement. They play sometimes in unison with the first. They do their own thing too, but mostly what they're for is to echo the first. And it is essential in playing this music that you observe the convention of period seating, which was actually the convention until Stokowski in the 1920s, which is that you have the first violins on the left and the second violins on the right, stereophonically laid out, because they're answering each other. One's doing do-do, the other one goes do-do, so they're echoing. And you want to see the echo as a visual effect. And if it's in stereo, you want to hear it ping, pong, coming out of each speaker. It's important that they be separated physically in space to maximize that feeling of echo effect. Now, everybody talks about how this is in the Echo Symphony, and it's wonderful. And I'm going to play you the exposition only, but we're going to hear it twice because I want you to note something about it, but I want you to listen to it first. So let's listen to the exposition, the first big chunk of the slow movement. It's about like a minute. It's not very long, but you'll hear the delicious echo effects. echoey, delightful, isn't it? But that's not the point. Not the only point, anyway. Yes, it's charming and fun to listen to, and definitely an echo thing. But did you notice? Did you notice after that first movement with its tricky phrasing that we have even more tricky phrasing? This exposition, just so you know, is 33 measures long. So there is an extra bar. If we were doing normal 8-measure periods, we would have 4 of them, but 32 measures. But there's another one. There's one more. But it's not like he just tacks the number 33 on at the end, even though that ending is delightful, because you never know when the echo is going to stop, do you? It just keeps echoing, and we'll hear it again. So if you missed that, you can hear it this time around. But no, what makes it so fascinating is that the echo effects completely disrupt our sense of 8-bar regular phrasing. They all sound like there's some irregular number of phrases, because it can echo once, it can echo twice. You think the music stopped, then you hear the echo. It's a fabulous way to build on and develop what we heard in the first theme of the first movement. The idea of this very flexible and unpredictable phrasing. So I want you to listen to it again. Don't try to count. Don't worry about counting. Just listen to how the echoes totally throw off our idea of where the normal melody will end. It's just such a bit of genius. See, lots of composers wrote echo effects. Echoes have been around forever. I mean, when I was in high school glee club, we sang something by Orazio Vecchi called the Echoes Song. It was a choral work where you're echoing, and it's entirely regular. You can tell exactly when the echoes are coming in and how long they're going to last. But Haydn isn't going to make it that simple, or he's not going to make it that boring. Let's put it that way. He's going to keep it constantly interesting and use the echo not just as an effect in itself, but in terms of the broader scheme of contrasts that characterize the symphony as a whole. So here it is again. And now listen to it with that aspect of it, the phrasing of the melody, in mind. See, this is why you listen to classical music more than once. That's what makes it a classic, because you hear things you didn't hear before. That's why it justifies repetition. You know, I'm sure that Prince Esterhazy heard this movement and said, "Oh, the echo's charming. Let's hear it again." And so when they played it again, he went, "Oh, wow, there's a little more than just an echo there, isn't there?" That's the point. And you can listen to it as many times as you want, and you're going to hear more fascinating things each time. So, moving right along, the minuet, the delightful minuet. The minuet, because we've had all of this kind of rhythmic and phraseological instability, the minuet is quite regular. It's an island of absolute normalcy in all of this quirky phrasing and whatnot. However, I'm not even going to play you the outside bits of the minuet, which are delightful, but we don't need to listen to them because I've just sort of told you what they are. It doesn't mean the music isn't good. And you do have to hear it within the context of the whole symphony because it serves that purpose. But, you know, it doesn't serve that purpose the way I do it in these talks. What I want you to hear is a bit of the trio, because in the trio, Haydn introduces the second aspect of unity that's going to pull the whole symphony together, especially in these last two movements. And that is instrumental timbre. And we've talked about this so many times. the timbre of the trumpets and high horns is already automatically a unifying element throughout the symphony. You hear it in 3 of the 4 movements, and you know that it serves the purpose of telling us this is Symphony number 38, which has this particular sound. However, Haydn goes a step further. It turns out that the Esterhazy Orchestra in 1768 had a new oboist, and I have his name here. Let me get his name. Thank you, Wikipedia. It's so handy. There it is. Vittorino Colombazzo. That was him. He was an oboist, a virtuoso oboist. And so Haydn wrote, we think, I mean, there was nothing stopping him from doing this before, but we think that this was his introduction to the prince. He wrote a little, hi, here's your new oboist. That was a good hire. You picked him. You knew how to pick him, your highness, That was the idea. So the trio of this Minuet is a wonderful, wonderful oboe solo. And it really shows off the whole range of the instrument. The beginning of the second half of the melody is womp, 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 womp. It's hilariously funny, first of all, but it's also a fantastic display of virtuosity on the part of the solo oboist. So here is the trio of the Minuet. A lovely opportunity for the oboist to strut his or her stuff. In those days, it was always a his, but these days it could be either. Now, Haydn being Haydn, he is not just going to throw in the oboe solo and then forget about the man. No, he's going to use the timbre of the oboe as yet another aspect of the symphonic nature of the music, binding it all together into one inseparable whole, even though it has 4 different movements. They belong together, and he does it by giving the second subject of the finale to the solo oboe as well. So we get to hear some more oboe. Now, some people have said, I was reading that Wikipedia article, for example, and they said, perhaps Haydn wrote the first 2 movements before the last 2, and they hadn't hired the oboist then because they're so different. That is such a dumb thing to say. It's such a misunderstanding of how Haydn operates. It really, really is, because there are things that all of the movements have in common. Already, as we've pointed out, the trumpets, the drums, the horns, the whatnot. There is the interesting phrasing, but the oboes only occur in the last 2 movements. It's an extra. It's an extra dose of symphonism. And there's no reason why Haydn had to do it in every movement. He would have tired the poor man out. His lips would have fallen off. I mean, it's not an oboe concerto. There's a zillion reasons why Haydn had no problem waiting until the finale, the last 2 movements, to bring in the solo oboe. I mean, not only is it a wonderful additional way to bind the symphony together, but it's a completely new contrast. I mean, Haydn didn't use the winds at all in the second movement. Contrast is the name of the game. So he's creating unity within diversity. If you guys are like Vulcans, remember those guys? Was it this or this or was it this or, I don't know. They did that infinite diversity and infinite variety or whatever that thing was. That's what Haydn's doing. He can create variety while also paradoxically binding the work together. And that's what he does in this finale. We're going to play the whole finale. The opening subject, the opening theme is just marvelous. You get to hear it twice, as you did in the first movement. It is also a very syncopated, rhythmically quirky tune, but it's presented with a very, very rhythmically regular accompaniment, which makes the whole thing just sound so much fun. The accompaniment is just 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. It's like a pop song, you know? Although the melody isn't, but the rhythm is just wonderful. And you hear that twice. And then you get to hear some very contrapuntal. We haven't had a lot of counterpoint in this symphony. We really haven't. But the motion music between the first and the second subject is very, very busily contrapuntal, which is wonderful. It gives a whole new and lively texture to the thing. And then the oboe comes in, chirping away. And that's all you need to know about it. You can listen to the whole movement, no repeats, of course, but the whole movement, and it's completely refreshing and delicious, and a wonderful summary of the symphony as a whole. As we've heard it up to this point, it has all of the elements that we have enjoyed so far, and new stuff besides. And that is quite a gift. Here is the finale. So there it is, Symphony number 38. Another fabulous symphony that no one ever listens to, that never gets played, that people think, can be safely ignored in light of all the marvelous masterpieces that Haydn wrote later. Well, it can't be. You can't ignore any of Haydn's marvelous masterpieces because he started with them and just went up from there. That's the truth. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.